take-home exam is due. I hope everyone found that exercise amusing.
We pushed it back to Tuesday.
Oh, we pushed it back to Tuesday. Oh, all right.
I meant to email you and completely forgot.
Never mind.
We did.
All right. We need to talk again about the things related to the chapter dealing with the Mongols in the east and the Mongols in the west. And for the last couple of days, I've entertained this thought and that thought and t'other thought and so forth, and didn't come up with a whole lot. Maybe it's because the chapter was well written and wasn't all that more that needed to be said. Maybe it was because I didn't know enough about the subject, although I think I wrote the chapter. I actually just rewrote Pamela Crosley's chapter. There are certain things that you look at it more broadly and you find somewhat curious, though it's a little hard to know what to make of it. For example, where the Mongols ruled directly, which would be outside of their home territories in Central Asia, Iran and China, the period of Mongol rule is a period of a pretty high cultural performance that has comparatively little anti-Mongol feeling or feeling by the Mongols against the indigenous populations. In the areas where they ruled as overlords, which would be true of Korea and Eastern Anatolia, Russia, you have patterns of cooperation that are roughly similar, and in some ways the areas that where they did not penetrate are the areas where they seem to have had the almost mythic impact that is attributed to them generally. Places like Lithuania, Eastern Europe in general, Mamluk, Egypt, and Japan, suggesting that the perception of the Mongols as a force in history is, like so many other things in history, variable depending on where you're looking from. And without a Mongol-authored, Mongol-central narrative, you're almost always confined to one of these external viewpoints. Having said that, yeah, well, what more is there to say about the Mongols? What I did last time was to talk about non-Mongol things I wanted to talk about, namely the Mamluks and the changes that occurred in the Mamluk period, that is to say in the 13th century, beginning of the 14th century, that were not generated by the Mongols, but developments that had, in a sense, been disguised by the fact that the historical narrative is so heavily dominated by the fear of the Mongols. You might say something similar about Japan, where the fear of the Japanese had of another Mongol invasion played an important role in the shaping of the Japanese polity, and yet most of the things that characterize the later shogunate in Japan as it emerges are not primarily or even in any substantial measure attributed to the Mongols. I would say there's no cultural influence or anything like that. So with the Mongols, it depends a bit on what you see, depends on where you're looking from. And so what I'm going to talk about, instead of going through a rundown of what these views might be, I'm going to talk about food. I've mentioned before in this class that food history is in a state of rapid development. Lots of historians are focusing on the history of food, and it has the virtue of being something that can interest historians of every period, every part of the world, because everybody eats. The degree to which the subject is studyable by historians depends a lot on sources, but the nice thing about food is that the sources can be so diverse. Some of them will be narrative sources where you have descriptions of banquets, or kind of ethnographic comments made by writers. Some of them are archaeological, where you actually find the remains of meals or kitchens or garbage pits. Some of them are visual. For example, when you read that the most important banquet foods in 15th century or 16th century Europe were birds, and primarily cranes and herons. You can go to paintings of the period of Rembrandt and see paintings showing a whole parcel of upper class Dutch members of some company at the dining table. And you look at what's on the dining table and you find they're mostly birds with long curvy necks. And you say, those are the cranes that they used to eat. But what I want to focus on does relate to the Mongol period in one sense. In our chapter, we try to draw commonalities between different societies in different parts of the world, some in the West, some in the East, that change in response to the Mongol onslaught. And for the East Asia, we have a heading that says, East Asia emerges, in which we sort of look at the 13th century and into the 14th century as a time when you get a spreading and a broader generality of culture, particularly associated with the spread of Confucianism, or in the Neo-Confucian form, which had nothing whatsoever to do with Mongols. But one of the things that doesn't really become so homogenized is food in East Asia. Mongol, Chinese, Korean, and Japanese cuisines are markedly distinct from each other. I would imagine the same is true if you get down into Vietnam, but I don't know enough about Vietnamese cooking in its earlier phases to comment on that. But what you have is a persistence of diversity, even as the upper classes become more and more oriented toward similar views, whether those are reverence for the Confucian classics and appraisal of the qualities of someone to hold official office as dependent upon their mastery of the Confucian classics, or whether it is a homogeneity based on the spread of Buddhist views, particularly either in the Pure Land sect or in the Zen form of Buddhism, Zen in Japan, Chan in China, and I don't remember the Korean word for the equivalent. But at the level of food, they remain rather separate. Contrast that with the West. A meal in Baghdad or Rome or Paris or Copenhagen or Amsterdam, say, would be pretty much identifiably a meal, regardless of the language spoken or the particular cultural characteristics of the society, whether they were Muslims or Christians, or whether Eastern Christians or Latin Christians. There are significant variations. In an earlier chapter in the book, we spoke about a sort of Mediterranean diet that emphasized olive oil and seafood and grain, versus a Germanic diet farther to the north that emphasized dairy products, butter, meat, and beer instead of the wine that you would have in the south. And as you go over into the Middle East, you have some more variations. But by and large, the West has a fairly uniform notion of food. Not surprisingly, given the way in which world history has been slanted in the writing of it by Western historians, a key part of it is cereal grains, and in particular wheat. The West loves its bread, and before wheat was developed enough to really produce bread well, they loved their porridge. You know, nothing like oatmeal to get you going in the morning or the afternoon or evening or pretty much any time of day. So you had boiled grain or baked bread, which could either be leavened or unleavened. You had a set of vegetables that you could put in that boiled grain or eat along with the bread. And by and large, those vegetables are ones that we would recognize now. There are some vegetables that you had in classical antiquity and into the Middle Ages that we don't eat so much now, but it's not extraordinarily different. This is a cookbook from Imperial Rome by an author named Apicius. It's the best known Roman cookbook. It is supposedly reflects the imperial taste in Rome. It's in 10 books, and when you look at the topics in the books, I'm certainly not going to go into menus here or recipes, because this particular translation was done by people who were known to be good cooks, but not particularly good at Latin. Therefore, they say it's an improvement because you can use the recipes, but there are perhaps some lapses in the Latin side of it. So in book 6, devoted to fowl, here are the chapters. Ostrich, chapter 1, you have boiled ostrich, ostrich stew. With boiled ostrich, it's good to have pepper, mint, cumin, leeks, celery seed, dates, honey, vinegar, raisin wine, broth, a little oil. Boil this in the stock kettle. Put everything in the kitchen in the kettle with the ostrich and boil until tender. So you have ostrich. Chapter 2 is devoted to crane or duck, partridge, doves, wood pigeon, squab, and diverse birds. Chapter 3 is devoted to thrush. Chapter 4 to the fig pecker. I don't know what a fig pecker is. Chapter 5 to the peacock. Chapter 6 to the pheasant. Chapter 7 to the goose. And chapter 8 to the chicken. And of course, the striking thing here is that the chicken comes last, whereas we would probably assume that the chicken would come first in most lists of fowl. But there is a preference implied here for wild birds over domestic birds. So the goose and the chicken are at the bottom of the list. Peacock and pheasant that come just before them are domestic, sort of, in Roman times. And then above that you have wild birds, including duck, which seems to be more important here as a wild bird. That's book 6. Book 7, labeled Sumptuous Dishes in this translation. It has 17 chapters. The number 1, the first one, is sow's womb, cracklings, bacon, tenderloin, tails, and feet. And you think, well, that pretty much covers the pig. But no, because chapter 2 is sow's belly. Chapter 3 is fig-fed pork. Then you have chops and steaks, then roasts, then boiled and stewed meats, then paunch, then loins and kidneys. One suspects that the loins are actually the testicles. Then pork shoulder, livers and lungs, homemade sweets. I'm not quite sure whether that is sweetbreads or not. Bulbs and tubers, mushrooms, truffles, snails, and eggs. All these in the same book. Nothing wildly ununderstandable, although I must say, if you where it is in Volpone, where the guy talks about his feast of the swelling, unctuous teat of a pregnant sow new cut off, and you think, what a disgusting meal. But pregnant pigs were indeed a particular delicacy. And the unborn, suckling pig is good, but hey, unborn pig, that's going to be even more tender. So the swelling, unctuous teat of the pregnant sow new cut off was in fact a delicacy that charmed people. In book 8, you have quadrupeds. And here we have wild boar, venison, chamois and gazelle in the same chapter, wild sheep, beef and veal, kid and lamb, pig, hare, and dormouse. Again, the preference here is for the wild animals, or at least they take precedence, which I am understanding to be preference, over the domestic animals, so that wild boar is number 1, whereas pig is number 7. And there is a great question whether in terms of cuisine, whether people distinguished, what distinction people drew between boar and pig. I was in a restaurant in Prague a number of years ago that featured various somewhat unusual meats, and on the menu it had a dish called wild boar Jewish style. And I thought, gee, this sounds kind of strange. And so I asked our host, a very right-wing Catholic gentleman, whether he thought there was some sort of contradiction in having a pig served Jewish style. I think in the back of my mind, I thought that he was going to say that this is the way Jews were served. But he said, well, what's the problem? I said, well, boars are pigs, and Jews don't eat pigs. And so he had never heard of that odd belief. So I ordered the dish, and then as I was eating it, he said, I see you ordered it, and you broke your law. I said, well, actually, I'm not Jewish. I just wanted to see what Jewish style meant. And with onions. You know, stewed up with onions. It was pretty good, actually. But, you know, this is Roman period, and as you go forward, even though the sources become less detailed for the West, though we do have some very good information on cooking in the Islamic Caliphate, there are no big surprises. If there is a unified culture in the sort of northwest quadrant of the Afro-Eurasian landmass that encompasses Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, one of the ways of seeing that is to look at a fairly common diet throughout the area. There is nowhere near the difference among the different cuisines, whether we're talking about Persian or Turkish or French or British, I suppose, if we can use the word cuisine there. There is nowhere near the difference that you get among these various cuisines compared with the difference you would get in East Asia among various cuisines. Now, the reason I bring this up in this particular lecture is that I want to talk a bit about a book that is quoted in a rather brief section in the chapter that you're to have read for today. And this is a book by Paul Buell and Eugene Anderson. It's entitled A Soup for the Khan, spelled Q-A-N instead of the K-H-A-N that we're more familiar with. What it is a cookbook that was prepared for the descendants of Kublai Khan. Kublai Khan was the grandson of Genghis Khan. He was born in 1215 in the Mongolian steppe land. In other words, he sort of the last of his line of the family to actually grow up in the Mongolian homeland, in the Mongolian tradition. By 1274, the conquest of China that had been begun by Genghis Khan, in the same time frame of the first invasions in the Middle East in the second decade of the 13th century, by 1274, China had really been conquered by the Mongols, and the Chinese army, the Mongol armies, had pushed on into Korea, northern Vietnam, then called Annam, and were poised to invade Japan. The capital for the Mongols was Beijing, which they, sort of the emergence of Beijing, it pre-exists, but as the main imperial capital of China, it really comes into its own at this time. And there was a resort area known as Shangdu, which was northward toward the steppe land, toward Mongolia, and that is what becomes the Xanadu in Coleridge's poem. The cookbook that we have for the ruling family of the Khans was written by a gentleman with a Chinese name, although it is assumed that he probably was not ethnically exclusively Chinese. It's assumed that he is probably, by the editors of this and translators, it's assumed that he was a mixed parentage, perhaps Chinese and Turkic of some sort, probably not a Mongol. It's a very extensive text. This is a 700-page book. It has, it's woodblock prints. And probably, it's certainly one of the most extensive cookbooks that we have from the medieval period. And what's extraordinary is that it is very specific to the Mongol ruling family. It reflects, from time to time, some influences from the Middle East. That is to say, you have some food products that have Middle Eastern names or are reminiscent of Middle Eastern dishes. And it reflects some of the tendencies from China. So you have some Chinese products and some Chinese medical views. But by and large, it appears to reflect the, is somebody's telephone ringing? And now you stopped it. So it reflects a Chinese view, particularly on the medical side. Now, it is striking how different the Mongol world was from the worlds of the people whom the Mongols conquered. And this shows up very strikingly in the foods that they consumed. Mongolia, of course, is primarily, down to the present day, a land of pastoral herders. There is only, I think there's still only one American fast food restaurant in Ulaanbaatar, the capital, and that is a branch of BD's Mongolian barbecue, which has a particular kind of cuisine where you grill meats that are skewered on a long sort of sword-like thing on a propane-heated griddle, and BD's Mongolian barbecue bears no relation to any known Mongolian practice. It is a Japanese style of cooking that they decided to name Mongolian for reasons I don't really know. But the Mongols had a diet that was extremely heavy in meat and animal products, but not notably in the meat of the horses. Horse was considered a delicacy. Occasionally you would eat horse on a ceremonial occasion, but by and large horses were too valuable simply as wealth to slaughter and eat. So the most common domestic animal was the sheep as a meat animal, and pigs, which would of course be extremely common in China, were seldom eaten. They didn't have herds of pigs. But when you look at the list of animal foods contained in the book, it is striking both for its variety and for the difference between Mongolian notions of meat eating and what you have elsewhere. Here's a list of the meats, of the animal foods, the meats that were eaten. You can compare them with what I said earlier about the examples from Rome. Sheep, ox, sheep, gazelle, the blue sheep, horse, wild horse, elephant, camel, wild camel, bear, donkey, sika deer, red deer, river deer, dog, pig, wild boar, otter, tiger, leopard, pear David's beer, musk deer, muntjac deer, fox, rhinoceros, wolf, hare, wildcat, tarbucan, weasel, and monkey. There are recipes for all of these animals in the book, and they're often very specific, like wolf's head gruel, or sheep brain puree, or things like that. I mean, it's every part of the animal that gets eaten. And when you look at the travelers who went to Mongolia, like Marco Polo, and talk about their eating, they stress the fact that everything is eaten. Other than the dung, every part of the animal gets eaten, and the bones are not given away to the dogs until they have been drained of their marrow. And the argument of these authors is that this was not a food-rich country, and therefore you ate everything that you had. Now that's the mammals. Then we get to the poultry. You have swan, oriental swan goose, wild goose, crane, Eurasian curlew, chicken, pheasant, eared fowl, duck, wild duck, tufted duck, mandarin duck, pigeon, dove, great bustard, collared crow, common quail, sparrow, and bunting. Sparrow and bunting. These are very small birds. And I've seen in food markets in Southeast Asia birds this big that are fried up and made available. So, but small birds were eaten earlier in Europe, though they're not mentioned in Apicius. They could be caught in nets fairly easily and toasted up. For fish, this is an area that doesn't have many fish, and most of the fish mentioned here are probably imported from China, although that wouldn't make a whole lot of sense to actually bring them to Mongolia. They're more likely to be ones that came to Beijing itself. Carp, golden carp, Chinese bream, whitefish, yellow shipfish, greenfish, sheatfish, sawfish, mud eel, bao yu, puffer, scianoid fish, abarku fish, good Persian name, qilam fish, soft-shelled turtle, crab, shrimp, sea snail, trough shells, whey, freshwater mussels, and the prickly sculpin. This is an enormous variety of animal foods that are listed in this book. I won't go on and read all of the fruits and all of the vegetables or all of the spices, but what you have here is a variety in which probably 2/3 or more of the items mentioned would be unfamiliar to palates at the western end of the Mongol Empire. This despite the fact that you'd had 1,000 years, close to 2,000 years of the Silk Road and exchange of products going across Eurasia. It just points out when you look at the at these various products that everything does not travel. The author of the book was a specialist on medicine, so he was particularly concerned with the medical indicators for each of these dishes. So he has a list here of the dispositions that would be cured by different things. So donkey's head gruel, that cures apoplexy of vertigo, debility of hand and foot, annoying pain of extremities, and trouble in speaking. Yeah, well, are any of those diseases? You know, I have some problems with my hands and feet and trouble in speaking sometimes. And occasionally I get an annoying pain in my extremities. I've had vertigo once. Maybe I should have donkey's head gruel. I mean, you know, it's interesting the degree to which the medical section of the book is not oriented toward pathogens, but oriented toward indispositions, things that we would not necessarily consider part of a medical regime, that they're states of the person that you might want to correct in some fashion, but you wouldn't necessarily go to a physician to do it. That was donkey's head gruel, but donkey's meat soup, it cures wind, mania, and depression, and pacifies heart qi. Wind, mania, and depression. You have wind mania and...
Is there a comma after wind? Or
no, it's wind mania and depression. It's when the wind blows, you go, ah! That's wind mania. And wind depression is when it blows in the other direction, you say, oh, feel terrible. So then that's when you have donkey's meat soup. Fox meat gruel. It cures infantile convulsion, epilepsy, spiritual confusion, indistinct speech, and inappropriate singing and laughing. So, you know, if you get a singing or a laughing fit, you want to head right for the fox meat gruel. On the other hand, bear meat gruel cures the various winds, evil foot qi, numbness, insensitivity, and 5 flacidities, tendon and muscle spasms. Since it's very hard to know what these indispositions are without, you know, coming at it from the point of view of Chinese medicine, you don't know quite where to go with this, except that the foods themselves are so suggestive. Kudzu starch gruel, hemp seed congee, black donkey skin soup, wild pig meat broth, otter liver gruel. Now, then there's a section that tells you about the things that you cannot eat with each other, that just don't go well together. If one has taken Chinese foxglove, one must not eat prepared stinking elm. If one has taken false hellebore, one must not eat orangutan meat, which is not mentioned as one of the animals that the Mongols ate. And there are no orangutans anywhere remotely close to Mongolia. If one has taken China root, one must not eat vinegar. If one has taken Chinese asparagus, one must not eat carp. And there's a whole list of those. Then you have stuff that appears to be extremely practical. Benefits and harmfulness of foods. If flour has a stinking smell, it cannot be eaten. If fresh ingredients are discolored and stink, they cannot be eaten. If broth is old and food is watery, it cannot be eaten. If one boils meat and it does not change color, it cannot be eaten. If the various meats are not slaughtered, they should not be eaten. Now, that's a very curious one, because it suggests that the method of slaughtering is an important factor. If the various meats smell and are spoiled, they cannot be eaten. The various brains cannot be eaten. Any sacrificial meat which moves on its own cannot be eaten. Yeah.
Wouldn't it saying that you can only eat meat that's been slaughtered?
Rule out all that wild?
Well, might that have to do with not eating carrion flesh?
Oh, yes. Probably so. That probably is to keep away from carrion. Neither horse's liver nor cow's liver can be eaten. A hare with closed eyes cannot be eaten. One cannot use mulberry wood fire for roasting meat. Hare meat should not be eaten during the 2nd month. Avoid storing various meat jerkies in rice. There is poison. 700 pages of this pithy advice on eating, designed to inform the court of the Mongols. It is striking how little overlap you find in this between what's here and what is on the Chinese restaurant menu that you look at when you're doing takeout ordering. It's a different world. And of course, the dairy products, which I haven't talked about here, are ones that are comparatively rare in Chinese cooking of that era. Fermented mare's milk is almost a staple for the Mongols, although they also had fermented other milk. They had fermented camel's milk as well. But fermented mare's milk, even though they didn't eat the horses, they would, particularly during the spring foaling season when they had a lot of milk, that was the preferred time to consume fermented mare's milk. There are a lot of beverages listed, but they are not alcoholic beverages. They're herb teas of the most remarkable diversity and so forth and so on. Okay, so the Mongols rule a tremendous area, that they have certain food practices and certain food preferences that don't appear to have had much impact outside the Mongol society itself. Although by Mongol here, probably I should include Central Asian Turkic, because the distinction culturally between the Mongol tribes and the Turkish peoples who became amalgamated into the Mongol army in the course of the conquest is not a particularly profound distinction. But it's indicative of the fact that the Mongols, though they set up an enormous empire of great importance for world history, did not create a cultural model. If you look at comparisons, you could say, well, did the Arabs set up a cultural model from Morocco to Central Asia when they carried out the conquests that established Islam in that region? If you went back to an Arabian cookbook of the time of the Prophet, it's not clear that you would find a very direct connection with what comes after the empire is formed. In other words, the Arabs may have been like the Mongols. They may have eaten one way when they were in Arabia, and then taken on the food practices of the people they conquered as they spread. The problem with the Islamic era cookbooks is that they represent the cuisine of the Abbasid Caliphate, and what we know about the food practices of the Arabs in Western Arabia at the time of the Prophet is much more limited and is contained to a substantial degree in hadith. Questions of what did the Prophet eat, or what did he approve of eating or not eating. And yet even so, there is little indication that you had a profound difference. I think you had a great increase in variety as you spread out from Arabia. But an Arab cuisine may have had some sort of broader impact, qua Arab cuisine, qua Arabian desert cuisine. Dates, for example. Did the Romans spread a cuisine? Or did Alexander the Great and the Greeks spread a cuisine? Very hard to affirm that, because these are empires that are expanding within a section of the world that already had a great deal of interaction over long periods of time, so that products that were available in the Roman Empire or in the Alexandrian Empire were products that had become available through commerce long before that time. Wine, for example. The spread of wine drinking is prior to the spread of the Greek culture, or later the Roman. One exception might be the Roman penchant for garum, which basically is spoiled fish sauce made out of sort of rotting anchovies, which is probably the closest thing to it is Worcestershire sauce, which is also made out of anchovies, which you don't want to know if you're someone who doesn't like anchovies on their pizza or anchovies on their Caesar salad, and then you read and you find that they're anchovies in the Worcestershire sauce. But the Worcestershire sauce tastes so good. But the Romans put garum on everything. It was the ketchup of the day, and they exported it, and garum containers have been found all over the Mediterranean area, and that was a Roman specialty, but it's one thing. So I would say that the question with the Mongols is that they conquered an area without leaving a profound trace on the area, even if they had a tremendous impact on its history. This has been examined in many other ways. For example, the comparative lack of Mongolian words that show up in languages in areas that the Mongols ruled. The comparative absence of Mongolian names, or either individual names or tribal names in areas that the Mongols occupied and had under their control for a century or so. The Mongol foot landed heavily but left very little footprint. Just thought of that. Isn't that a nice image? Foot landed heavily, but and it really sort of singles the Mongols out. Now let me turn to this issue of East Asia in particular, and the fact that not just that the Mongols did not have a impact on homogenizing the food culture of East Asia, but that the spread of those things that did transform in some degree the political and intellectual and ideological worlds of East Asia, such as Neo-Confucianism and Pure Land and Zen Buddhism, that they did not homogenize the food regimes either, because Japanese, Korean, and Chinese cuisine have remained strikingly distinct, except for the common consumption of rice. Not surprisingly, the data we have on the spread of rice farming from southern China and Vietnam into broader areas is often talked about by world historians as a major move, but in fact in northern China, other grains were used more than rice. And in Japan, you had buckwheat being used extensively in areas where rice did not grow. So rice has a certain geographical restriction to it. But even the way rice is cooked will differ from place to place. So the Korean cooking of rice in an iron pot will be different from the way it is cooked in China, say. In Korean cuisine, according to descriptions of eating etiquette, you do not pick up your rice bowl and hold it up to your face and eat from it. You leave it on the table and you eat from it that way, whereas the Chinese and the Japanese would both hold the rice bowl up. A table setting in Korea would always include a spoon and chopsticks, silver chopsticks if you had an elegant banquet. But the information we have on seating at banquets portrays the Korean model in a somewhat different fashion than the Chinese model. This is something that I've never really seen written up on a comparative basis, is the organization of banquets. But it happens to be something for which a lot of information is available on a cross-cultural basis. So for example, one of the descriptions of a Mongol banquet in China would say that the great Han sits at a table that is higher than anybody else's table, and then below him, slightly below him, are other members of his family, and then below them and pretty soon you figure, well, the great Han must be about 30 feet in the air, because everybody is below everybody else until you finally get down below. But the point was that supposedly everybody could see the great Han and observe him at the banquet, including the 40,000 onlookers who were there just looking at the banquet. You can get a contrast here with the banqueting practices of Baghdad under the Abbasid Caliphate, because there the caliph was on one side of a curtain, and nobody could see the caliph eat, but he could hear the conversation and, if he chose, contribute to it. But nobody got to see him eat. But then you had various rules of etiquette that we have details on. For example, no one is supposed to eat very much, because if you ate a great deal, it would indicate that you found the food more interesting than the presence of the caliph. So you're supposed to go to the banquet, look at the screen or the curtain behind which the caliph was presumed to be sitting, and simply play with your food because you were so in awe of the imperial presence. Unless, and here is an important exception that's listed in the book we have on this etiquette, unless you were known to be a great pig. If you were famous for overeating, then you were expected to go and make an absolute display of yourself by gobbling up everything around so that you would amuse the caliph. Now, how the caliph saw this, whether he's kind of peeking through a hole, I don't know. But certainly the ranks of people, who sits where with respect to the presence of the the caliph, that will be spelled out just as it is in these descriptions of Mongol banqueting and descriptions that we have of Korean banqueting. I never attended a banquet with the Shah of Iran, but I had friends who did before the Iranian Revolution. They said, and I did go to official banquets in Iran from time to time, and there the protocol was that you stand around and talk for a long time, and then presently they open the doors and you're invited into long tables that have myriad bowls and plates full of food on them. And there are no chairs and no tables. And you grab as much food as you can, as quickly as you can. And the tables are pretty much stripped of food in a matter of 5 minutes or so. And then you stand there and you eat your food, and then you go directly home. It's the very last thing that happens on the occasion. Now, and very reminiscent of descriptions that you have of triumphs after a battle, where all of the booty is laid out on a table, and the soldiers are invited in to grab what they can. And you have this image of, they fell on such and such like Turks falling on a table full of booty, because you can get some coins or a nice helmet or a sword or something like that. But friends of mine who went to imperial banquets said that you had the same thing, where you had a big table, long tables full of food, and then the Shah and the Empress were sitting à deux at a table on the far side of the room, having a dinner. And you were, the audience, the banquet guests, were to grab their food and eat, and nobody was allowed to have their back to the royal couple. So you're standing there eating, and I presume not eating too much, unless of course you're a pig. And you're observing the Shah and his Empress dining presumably on good Parisian cuisine, which was the taste of the Pahlavi family. And it's just striking how little change there was from what you find described in etiquette books of the 9th century. And on the whole, when you get into food history, one of the things that sometimes strikes you is how persistent foodways are, and how reluctant people are to give up their food habits. Some of the more variable practices are those that you find in Western Europe. And I think that's not in terms of the foods that are eaten, but in terms of the eating style. I think that's partly because the Western Europeans were barbarians, and ate in crude and unseemly fashion, and gradually developed better manners. But older societies that had ideas of etiquette, ideas of how to carry out a banquet, had much greater stability in the foodway department. In Korea, Korea is not the only part of East Asia that relishes eating dogs, but Korea has developed dog eating to a more refined level. Dogs are eaten particularly in southern China. In Taiwan, it's called fragrant meat. But in Korea, you have special restaurants set aside for the serving of dog. A special breed of dog is raised as a meat animal, and is completely distinct from the from dogs that are raised as pets and are esteemed as pets. Dog eating is primarily a summer, dish because it was felt to balance the seasonal effects of the summer. This is very important in humoral medicine, where you eat things that are supposed to compensate for changes in the weather or in your own bodily balance. So if you had hot and cold, wet and dry, then if you were in a very dry state, you would want to eat wet foods, and if you were in a hot state, you'd want to eat cold foods, and this becomes fairly well entrenched in the foodway traditions. In Iran, for example, you can look at cookbooks that will say that you, say if you make a dish like fesenjan, which is, well, it's just wonderful. It's a stew made up of pomegranate syrup, ground walnuts, onion, and what we would call chicken. The proper recipe calls for rooster, because this is a warming dish that is meant to be eaten in the winter when you're balancing the cold of the atmosphere. And a rooster is, the meat of a rooster produces a warm effect on the humor, whereas the meat of a hen produces a cooling effect. It's where these customs come from, it's hard to say, and I'm not always sure quite what the implication is, though I do recall vividly traveling one night from Nishapur to Sabzwar in order to spend the night with some Peace Corps friends, because there was a military group that had a movie, and we would get to see a movie and sleep on the floor, and it was worth traveling 100 kilometers in the middle of the night to see. And on the way, our driver stopped at a dark adobe hut beside the road, where he apparently customarily stopped in order to drink a great quantity of vodka, which he proceeded to do. But there was a marvelous woman there who, a great florid woman, hard to describe her. But the man had ordered rooster, and she took the rooster's head and sort of pulling her hijab partially over her mouth, she would nibble on the crest on the rooster's head with tiny little bites, and it was, I'm sure, intended to be something really, really, really sexy. But the idea of eating the rooster's head as a heating thing, I'm ready to eat the rooster's head, and what's your word for rooster in English? I don't know. It's when you run into something like that, you're struck by by both the persistence of foodways, but also the impenetrability of some of them. So I'm told that dog eating is a very special thing in Korea. There was a great debate at the time of the World Cup in Seoul whether they should suspend dog eating in order not to offend people, and other people said, well, the Americans don't give up eating beef when the Indians come for the Olympics, so why should we give up eating dog? Then you get to Japan, where you have a totally different cuisine in which anything that lives in the ocean is eaten, but very few land animals are eaten. And you don't have herd animals, you don't have by and large, you don't have traditionally the eating of lamb or pork, or you have some beef eaten, but usually superannuated plow animals rather than animals that have been raised for this purpose. Now all of this has changed, and if there is one world empire that is changing the foodways of the world, it's the United States. And one of the things of the last, let's say, post-World War II era has been the phenomenal shrinkage of the variety of foodways in the world as economic and sort of pseudo-scientific or health-related issues have pushed everybody toward eating beef, so that the Japanese and the Koreans now eat enormous amounts of beef, whereas before they ate none to speak of, push them to consume milk and milk products. Push them to consume more wheat. And basically there's a Western diet, essentially an American diet, that is taking over the world in a very striking way, particularly when you compare it with earlier episodes of imperial expansion, whether economic or political. So the British did not spread their diet, thank fortune, around the world. The French did not spread theirs, and certainly many parts of the world are still holding out against the globalization that we are currently experiencing based on sort of American practices. But it is a daunting phenomenon, and one that I think makes it all the more important for us to study the history of food, the history of etiquette, the history of banqueting, and things of this sort, in order to see what they can tell us about what really changes in the world and how those changes come about. A number of years ago, I was asked by a librarian at the law school to come over and take a look at several large boxes of books in Arabic that they wanted to dispose of. And I certainly was in no position to go through 5 or 6 large boxes of Arabic books and tell them what was important. They appeared to be primarily books of basically law books from various Arab countries that they no longer wanted. But somehow my eyes lit upon a book entitled Etiquette. It had the title on the cover in French, and in Arabic it had a much more elaborate title. And I plucked it out and I said, well, this looks interesting. The book was published in 1898, I believe, not in Cairo, but in Halwan, which was a spa that wealthy Cairenes and foreigners would go to take the waters. It's now been spoiled by a steel mill. And it was a very, very interesting book on etiquette by an Arab writer by an Egyptian writer. He was probably Albanian by family background. But it was an Egyptian writer who was trying to explain to Egyptians how Westerners live. And it was a very interesting introduction to the book. He said, these people have come to our land and observed us and studied us. They know how we get married. They know how we do circumcision ceremonies. They know more about what we do than we do. And we don't know anything about them. However, they have no respect for us because we do these funny things. That is to say, we are objects of anthropological observation. We dress in peculiar and unacceptable ways, and so forth and so on. And therefore, if you want to be taken seriously by the Europeans, you have to study them as closely as they study you. You have to learn their customs, their foods, their banqueting practices, all of the aspects of etiquette in daily life that they have studied with regard to you, you have to learn so that you can act like them, because only then will they respect you. You cannot wear a keffiyeh and expect anyone to respect you. You have to look like a European, but beyond looking like a European, you have to know how to act like one. And it proceeds over several hundred pages to describe exactly how Europeans behave, clearly based upon close observation. So there's a chapter on the dinner party. What happens at, quote, the dinner party? It says, well, initially there are beverages and people talk about this and that. Then they sit down at a table and the food is served and everyone falls silent. And then as they reach the point where they have satisfied their appetite, conversation resumes. But now, instead of being dispersed, it's now centered around the table, and everyone participates in the same conversation until they rise from table. There's more detail than that, but it accurately describes a dinner party in my apartment. And yet utterly different from everyone sitting on the floor around a tablecloth that's covered with food, and as soon as you finish, you get up and you go somewhere else and wash your hands. I mean, utterly different from a traditional Arab way of consuming a meal. There's a brief chapter on the honeymoon. What Europeans do after the marriage and the honeymoon, because the Europeans describe the Egyptian marriages, so now we describe how to ride in a carriage. Say, do not put your arm on the back of the seat if you're next to a woman, because even though you think it's on the back of the seat, she won't think it's on the back of the seat, that sort of thing. And the heart of the book is recipes. It's a description of foods, so that you know what the Europeans eat. And striking in this list of foods and recipes are little tipped-in illustrations that show you how to carve every food. That they must come from a previously published work, probably French. Like, how do you carve a rabbit? How do you carve this and that? And it's a book that I found particularly interesting for the reasons that I've talked about in this lecture. But then when I brought it to the attention of various Arab friends, I found that they were extremely offended by the book. And I thought, nobody should know about this book should disappear, it should never have been written, because it says that we should be like Europeans. And we are Arabs. We are completely different from Europeans. We, however, do buy our suits from very good London suit makers. We do go to upper class schools. We do go to dinner parties. But we go as Arabs in this special Arab way. And it just sort of sharpened in my mind this degree to which etiquette and food provide a lens for looking at cultural interaction, looking at the impact of empire, looking at the persistence and reassertion of diversity under changing political and intellectual influences, and all this adds up to a paean in favor of food history and etiquette history and banqueting history.